One night, my mate and I were camping by a secluded lake on my private property, deep in the Australian bush. Surrounded by towering gum trees, I lived about 35 to 40 minutes from the nearest town. It was a chilly evening in July, and the branches of the gum trees overhead were swaying ominously in the breeze. My friend, who I'll call Jack, joined me for the night. As we relaxed at the campsite, enjoying a bit of weed in front of the campfire, I had an idea for a bit of fun. Since we were both really high, we decided to go for a wander through the bush. Bad part is, neither of us had brought a flashlight. So Jack and I ventured down a narrow path into the enveloping darkness of the bush. Jack was a few steps ahead of me when he suddenly froze. I started hearing strange, unsettling noises. As I turned to my left, Jack remained fixed, staring straight ahead. A faint sound, like a distant tinkling of a bell, but not exactly like that, filled the air. The noise grew louder and closer until it seemed to be right beside me. In a moment of fear, I let out a sharp gasp. Jack turned around, his expression filled with concern. "We should go back," he urged, his eyes wide with alarm. Back at the campsite, Jack finally revealed, "You want to know why I wanted to turn back?" Intrigued, I asked, "Why?" "I saw something. A huge, shadowy figure just behind one of the trees," he replied, his voice lowering to a whisper. Apparently, while I was preoccupied with eerie sounds, Jack had been transfixed by a dark, indistinct shape that seemed to lurk in the darkness for what felt like an eternity, until my gasp broke the spell.
When I was a young fella, my brother and I would often take camping trips out to the river. It was usually just myself and my bro, but I remember this one trip, my stepbrother and his girlfriend came along. I vaguely remember parts of this trip, but some stuff stands out. I'll go over the one notable occurrence. That's what you're here for, right? The creepy stuff. Well, yeah, it definitely was that. We had been out that way many times, and despite it being quite an eerie-looking spot, it was never scary. I didn't think so anyway. The first time I remember being truly scared out there, it was myself, my brother and my stepbrother. We were walking and talking, and my stepbrother starts trying to scare us, telling us stories of things that supposedly lurked out there in the bush. I remember distinctly, this was the first time I ever heard about the Quinkins. He kept telling us random stories about people who had seen them. This would be my very first introduction to Aboriginal spirits and beasts. It wasn't at that point I got truly scared though. I was more fascinated than anything. I had always been into dark and scary things, so these stories, they simply captivated my imagination rather than freaked me out. It was when we rounded a bend and came into a large clearing, one that housed a very sizable waterhole, that the scary stuff began. I remember my stepbrother. He just stopped on the spot and, in an instant, turned and bolted off down the road. That gave me and my brother a fright. It wasn't entirely out of the ordinary though. This bloke was a weirdo, and he'd often do random shit like this. But then we saw what caused him to run. Picture this scene, right? This waterhole. It's pretty bloody big, and on the far side of it, there's this massive rock wall During the daylight hours, it's a popular activity for people to climb up the side and jump off into the water. At night, though, it's always deserted. Not tonight, though. We see it, and at first, it's just barely discernible shadows. Then we start to make out forms. My brother's the first to say it. Is that people up there? And we both just stare up. I saw it too. Yep, for sure. Human-shaped figures walking up the rocks, off to the side. There's about 5 or 6 of them, dragging their bodies up the scrub. Not walking. I mean, quite literally, dragging themselves up. Their arms and legs flailing outwards as they do so. As they get to the top, they all kinda line up side by side, still laying on their guts. Now, their heads and the tops of their torsos hanging over the edge of the rock wall. That's bloody dangerous. Yeah, people jump from there, but there's a certain spot you gotta jump from to clear any rocks beneath. These guys, they're aiming their heads right towards those rocks, and they're teetering right on the edge. At this point, we yelled out, "Hey, what are yous doing? Get down from there, you dickheads. You're gonna get hurt." But they didn't listen. Instead, in unison, they simply leaned further and further over the rock wall edge before plummeting downwards. We watched in horror as these people bounced off the rocks on the way down before splattering into the waters at the bottom, much of which made for shallow cover over sharp rocks just beneath the surface. There's no way in hell anyone's surviving that. We stood there in a state of shock at what we had just witnessed. We had just watched people die right in front of us. That horror lasted barely a second before it was replaced by another. For when we glanced back up to see if we could catch a glimpse of where they ended up, we surely did, but not as we expected. Cold fear gripped us in an instant as we watched these things bobbing up and down in the water, floating ever so slowly towards us, their heads straight up and ahead, their faces pointed at us. It was very clear now that we were not looking at human beings. These things were shadowy, dark, humanoid, but far from human. Their faces were the dead giveaway. You could barely make out these once human features, but the eyes were hollow, as were the mouths that gaped wide open as they floated through the water, coming ever closer to us. It is a strange sensation, being literally frozen in fear. Unless you've experienced it, you can't possibly understand it. But in that moment, all we could do was stand there in the night, nothing but the splish-splash of the water as these things bobbed up and down, ominously surfing their way towards us. It was only when they reached the banks of the waterhole and began dragging their disgusting forms up out of the water, and we got a close-up look at their gaping mouths and lanky, shadowy limbs, that we turned and ran, just as my stepbrother had before. It was obvious that these things were chasing us. As we clambered up the sands, making a beeline for the cover of the bush. We would steal glances back to see them practically floating after us. The strange thing was, once we hit the bush, they just kind of stopped. They were floating, dancing around on the sands. Not that we hung around to make sure that's all they were doing. We absolutely booked it back to camp, packed up our shit and told our stepbrother that we were leaving. That was my first and last time to see what I believe was a Quinkin. I mean, I have no idea what else it could have been. The description seems spot on. I suppose it could have been something else, another spirit of the land that I'm unaware of. But from the stories I've heard, that's what it was. Let me tell you, they scared me more than any other ghost I've ever heard tales of. The sheer oddity of what they were doing, yet how deliberate they were in their actions. The way they just slowly floated across that water. The way they toppled off the rock wall. None of it made any sense, and yet we were very clearly their target. I still don't know why they were coming for us that night, what their intentions were. I hate the thought of those wide, gaping mouths every time they appear in my nightmares. Yep, I still have those. People often talk of ghostly encounters with some sense of wonder, of fascination. But let me tell you, it's not. It's traumatic. It's terrifying. And I hope I never see these things again.
I'm an Australian scout, and about 2 years ago, I was a cub when this happened. The order goes Joeys, Cubs, Scouts, and Ventures if that helps. I went to this big cub camp, roughly 1,000 plus scouts. It's called Kubari. I'm not sure if I spelt it right. It's when cubs from all around Australia come together and do activities and do scout things. I don't know. Anyways, my group was called Cassowaries, with a bunch of boys and 7-ish girls. Me, my sister, and the other girls shared a tent. We stayed there for a week, but on the 5th night I woke up at around 3 to 5 a.m. by my sister. She looked terrified. She told me to look at the end of my sleeping bag. And when I looked there was blood. I crawled out of my sleeping bag and saw that there was a hole at the end of it. I looked at my foot, and there was a stab wound just under my toes. Me and my sister sat there staring at my foot until I noticed a light through the side of my tent. It looked as if a knife had cut through the tent and stabbed me. Me and my sister walked out of the tent with a flashlight. Our tent was right next to the fence. As we walked around the tent, I saw a pure white figure staring at me from behind the fence. My sister told me not too long ago that she saw the same thing. We woke the other girls and started to walk to the toilets. They were about 15 minutes from our tent. We told the other girls what we saw. My sister didn't say that she also saw the figure. One of the girls believed us. The others didn't. I showed them my foot and the hole in the tent, and they still didn't believe me. Ever since then, I've been having the same figure following me. Not in the open or in big crowds. They show up in my dreams. I've seen them quite a lot. I don't know how to communicate with them or if I want to. They act sorta as if they're my guardian, or they're trying to protect me. And it feels like they only show themselves when I'm doing something stupid or if I'm having bad anxiety. If you have any advice about what I should do, that'd be awesome. Thank you. G'day all. 40-something-year-old bloke with a story that I think would fit nicely here. Me and my mates go fishing and camping often, around the rivers in rural New South Wales. It was summertime, 2003, when this happened. We were all packed up and headed out for an alcohol-fueled weekend around Guinea, along the Manning River. It was a nice spot for fishing and some beautiful camping spots around those parts. So we're sitting around the fire that night, and as usual, we're all trying to spook each other, as you do out there late at night. Hey, boys just don't grow up, okay? We're chucking around ghost stories and tales of creepy crawlies, when all of a sudden, out of nowhere, me mates stop talking and just stare right over my shoulder. I think they're messing with me, so I just say whatever, but they just keep looking straight ahead, right into the bush. Well, starting to get a bit spooked now, I turn around in my chair, real quiet. At first I didn't see anything, nothing but shade of absolute black out there in the scrub. Then, one of the shades of black took 2 giant steps toward the camp. Holy shitballs, we were not sticking around for that. All of us piled into the car and locked the doors, just in time to see this thing take another step. We could see it clear by the light of the campfire now. It was at least 8 foot tall. My first thought was the stories of Yowies I'd heard growing up, but this didn't look like what I'd hear about them. It stood with bent knees, walking around sniffing the air. The arms were hairy, and the head looked like some kind of warped animal. That's what got me thinking, skinwalker. I know there's a Navajo origin, but it's the closest thing I could draw a comparison to. This giant bloody dog, bear, human thing turned and faced our car. And it just stood there, watching us, pacing back and forth. I don't know if it could see us. The car was parked back where it was a lot darker. So maybe not. But just in case, we squished ourselves down as far as we could go, until we couldn't really see it anymore, and hopefully it hadn't seen us. All night we stayed huddled like that, listening to this thing pace around, sometimes circling the car. We were too scared to open our eyes. Maybe it was looking in, right at us. I'll never know. All I know is that finally it left after what felt like hours, and I was glad to never see it again. To this day, I have no idea what we saw. Yowie? Australian skinwalker? Something else entirely? I'll never know. And you know what? I never want to.
Have you ever visited Australia? I'm guessing most of you who have said yes have probably seen the sights of Sydney, Melbourne, maybe Brizzy and the Gold Coast. If you've never been to the north, you've missed out. Picture sprawling, white sand beaches, lush rainforests and rolling green hinterlands. At the heartland of all this, North Queensland's tropical urban playground, Cairns. That's where I based myself during my last trip to Oz. There's more than enough to do in and around Cairns that you can easily kill 2 or 3 weeks. And that I did. I snorkeled, I dived, I fished, I hiked, and I swam to my heart's content. The whole trip was set to culminate with a 3-night hike and camp excursion into one of the region's most extensive rainforests, the Daintree. A group of 5 of us, including the tour guide, would take part. They like to keep the groups for these tours small so as to minimize their impact on the natural environment. We set off on a Sunday morning, fog enveloping the road, as we headed off toward our point of entry. My senses went into overload as soon as I stepped out of the van and took in the smells and the sights of the rainforest. It was nothing short of breathtaking. Hours and hours we trekked, our guide ensuring we followed a path of relative safety along the way. I say relative because, well, that's what it was. We all signed waivers before embarking on this tour, and we were all aware of the risks. There are a great many things within the Aussie rainforests quite capable of killing you. Not least of all, the mighty cassowary birds. And if you get close enough to the Daintree River, you might just find yourself an easy meal for a crocodile. I was confident, however, that our guide would get us through safely. I wasn't going to waste my time worrying about things that could go wrong when I was surrounded by some of the most beautiful natural scenery on the entire face of this planet Earth. Day 1 came to an end and it was time to set up camp. We did so in a small natural clearing. This was part of the appeal of this tour. Nothing we were going to see, sleep on, nor walk on was man-made. Well, aside from our swags, of course. We settled in for the night, and I fell into a blissful sleep, drifting off to the ambient sounds of the night. We all awoke the next morning to birdsong, a light patter of rain, and the morning sun shining tiny little rays of light down beneath the thick canopy. Even at full pelt, it struggled to break through. So, a lot of the time we were left relying on our flashlights. It must have been a couple of hours into the next day's hike when we noticed a member of our group was missing. Instantly, our guide went into protocol mode, backtracking the path that we had come from. He was, of course, reassuring everyone, keeping us calm. But I could see it in his eyes. The fear was setting in. This wasn't right. A member of our group had disappeared within a matter of seconds, without anyone noticing. We were rightfully scared. But it was when we spun around to find a second member of our group gone that the panic really set in. Myself and the remaining member of our group resolved to keep each other in eyeshot at all times. The tour guide wasn't taking any more chances, grabbing me by the arm and exclaiming, "We're leaving, now." Didn't need to tell me twice. We began the long trek back out of the rainforest. Strangely, our guide continuously urged us to walk with haste, but not to run. I found this odd, of course, as if there was something out here picking people off. Wouldn't we want to get the hell out of here as fast as possible? Occasionally, our pace would quicken into a jog, and our guide would hiss at us, "Slow down, don't move too quickly." And so we obeyed, walking as quickly as we could, while making the least amount of noise possible. As we walked, I began to notice things, shadows, just out of the corner of my eye. Imperceptible at first, but more and more noticeable the longer we walked. They began as flashes, something I could pass off as nothing. And at first, I was resolved to not look anywhere but straight ahead. It was not until one of these shadows caught my eye, and then failed to leave the edges of my vision, that I took a peek. not normal. What I was looking at was entirely wrong. It was something resembling the human form, but hunched, thicker than it should be. A look of complete and total emptiness on its face as its beady, black eyes stared back at me. A feeling of something ancient, something primitive, something altogether wrong. The others had noticed it too, it seems, as all three of us were now locked in the trance I had found myself in. Our breaths short, quickening. And as we gazed, it began to step forward. One step, then another, then another. The crunch of a dry leaf beneath its awful form was enough to snap us out of our stupor, as our guide breathed a quick series of words, which we followed without question. On my mark, follow me. Do not look back. Run. And so we did. We ran. We ran faster than I ever thought possible. All the while, I could hear something behind us. Something inhuman. Something moving much faster than it looked like it should have been able to. I began to feel my breathing intensify, my lungs burning, my legs inevitably turning to jelly. Adrenaline was pushing our bodies far past the point of physical exhaustion, and I knew it would only be a matter of time before instinct could fuel us no further. For one of us, this would sadly not be an issue, as I saw a black flash roar past me and drag my one remaining tour companion into the forest. I heard the most god-awful scream I have ever heard, and as I continued to run, to my horror, I heard the unmistakable sound of a man being eaten alive. Those sounds will haunt me until the day I take my final step into death's embrace myself. We did not stop. We continued running until the canopy began to open up, until the sun began to beat down upon us, until finally we emerged from that damned rainforest, from that nightmare. The two of us practically threw ourselves into the van, and we floored it off down the tiny access road. I lay in the back, exhausted, traumatized, and absolutely devastated. I had just witnessed something not of this earth, something vile, something evil. I would never forget the look of that thing as it took those slow steps toward us. That look on its face, that look of utter indifference towards us. It had no sympathy for us. All it knew is that it was hungry. I've never experienced a feeling like that before. A feeling of a complete and total lack of empathy being felt towards you. It is the most helpless I have ever felt in my life, and I hope I never experience that again. That drive out of the rainforest, down that lonely access road, was absolutely harrowing. For as I gazed out of the side of the window of the van, I saw something that made me realize just how lucky I was to still be among the land of the living. I saw the unmistakable sight of dozens, no, maybe hundreds of pairs of beady eyes staring out from within the trees.
Let's get one thing straight. I've hiked the Blue Mountains before, but nothing, I mean nothing, could have prepared me for what I experienced during what was supposed to be a routine trek through its canyons. It began as a clear morning, the kind Aussies brag about. The eucalypt haze that gave the Blue Mountains their name wrapped around the cliffs in a dreamy shroud. I set off from Katoomba, pumped for a day of solitude and the haunting beauty of the Gross Valley. Honestly, I should have turned back when I first felt that tingle on my neck, the one you get when you think someone's watching you. But being the dauntless bloke I pretend to be, I chalked it up to the chill of the mountain air. Bad call. I missed the trail marker, mind set on the shifting shadows between the gum trees, and that's when I got lost. The paths here wind around and double back like a snake. I've trekked them plenty, but today they had teeth, and they bit me, hard. Hours passed, and I realized I was properly stuffed. Night fell like a curtain, fast, unforgiving. I've never known dark like that, not the city kind. This was a velvety, pressing darkness that oozes into your bones and stays there. My phone's flashlight cut through it like a weak whisper against the thunderstorm. Every tree looked like a gnarled hand, and every bush rustle felt like a warning. Here's the goosebump bit. I wasn't alone. Not once did I see it clearly, but by the twitch of twilight, there was something behind me. A presence that hummed with malice. You know those stories of Aussie spirits? The ones old-timers talk about in hushed tones by the fire? I'd laugh them off, but out here, laughter was about as useful as an ashtray on a motorbike. It felt like a hunt, and I was the quarry, stumbling over roots, my breath a ragged prayer. My phone beeped a low battery warning. Seriously, now? I pushed through the bush, gripping the phone like a talisman. But even tech's cold comfort was slipping away. The hours to dawn stretched eternal. My world shrunk to the feeble circle of my dying light. When the brush gave way to an open dirt road, it felt like a mirage. I was giddy with relief, like this was some twisted, outback Wizard of Oz junk. There wasn't a yellow brick road, but I'd have kissed the dirt if I hadn't been so parched. I followed it, boots crunching. When the ranger station silhouetted against the night, I could have wept. The ranger was a bloke named Darryl. Look of a man who's seen it all, and then some. He listened to my tale with a grave nod and gave me a lift back to my ute, throwing glances to the rear view, like he expected my ghostly mate to be thumbing a ride. "Don't hike alone," he said, his voice almost lost in the engine's growl. "Especially not when the mountain's restless." I haven't been back since. People say it was all in my head. Dehydration, panic, the bush playing tricks. Maybe they're right. But sometimes, when the city's asleep and my flat's quiet, I swear I hear that whisper of a presence. Feel that shiver down my spine. Sydney's got enough to explore without looking for trouble. You ever find yourself up in the Blue Mountains? Stick to the beaten path. And for the love of all that's holy, respect the signs. Both the ones in the ground and the ones in the gut. And bring a bloody good torch. Hello watchers and listeners, thank you so much for watching. If you have a story to share, please send it to my email in the description below. This channel is mostly made up of stories sent in by viewers or people they know. Another way to support the channel is to sign up for my Patreon, where you can watch my videos ad-free. More perks will be added in the new year. Also, I will be adding new designs to the merch store, so keep an eye out for that. Thank you all for your continuous support. And remember,
Papa loves you.